The stuff I'm going to talk about today is a little bit less technical than what everyone before me has spoken about. It's really around some ideas that I've been thinking about over the last few years of how to integrate all sorts of different people, particularly in big teams in high performance sport, professional sport. And Kate touched on some of the concepts a little bit of how do we integrate decision making, how do we have shared decision making, and what does that look like? How can we support decision making models really? So one model that I like is from Samakutsu's work, a little editorial that he wrote here, where he talked about all these things integrating to aid decision making in the day-to-day service to athletes. The ones in red here I've added. So I think the athlete values are super important to integrate in your decision making process. But I also think coaching values are important to include. So if you go from one coaching group to another within the same sport, or you can have a change of coaching group within the same club even, the values of those coaches might change how you go about things. And I think sometimes we like to think that the science is a little bit above that, and that we shouldn't even be thinking about that because this decision might be right and that decision might be wrong. But in reality, if you're clashing with the coaching group and you're not supporting their values, you run into a lot of issues. The best relevant evidence, I think, is something that we all understand, and obviously there's limitations to how to apply that and limitations in what we know. We know more in some areas and less in other areas. But the coaching expertise is something that I feel like almost conflicts with the best relevant evidence at times. Sometimes we feel like we've got a coach who's got 20 years worth of experience and we're saying, well, there's a paper that came out last year that says we should do it differently to that. And so where do you find the middle ground? And I really think the coaching expertise is, as scientists, something that we don't harness enough of at times. So that's something that I want to talk a little bit about today. And then another one that I've added is the particular sport, the club, the environment, the country. For me now, being in a different country, the culture of that country, sport, league is something that impacts the decision-making process. So just a general model that I think thinking about these things can help in the decision-making process. The ultimate goal of making the best decision for the athlete, and usually for a lot of us here, talking about it in a team context. If you're talking about individual sport, obviously there's one athlete, but we're looking to help athletes within a team context, which can present some challenges at times as well. So this is a paper from Patrick Ward, Johan Wint and Tommy Kempton. And I read this, I can't remember when it came out. I think it's been around for 18 months or so now in the earlier versions of it. But I love some of the things they talk about here, and they're particularly talking about sports scientists and how we can support decision-making models throughout an organisation. And they talk about embedding scientific principles, but then also creating systems, harnessing data analysis and communication, which really empower people in their domains. So when I thought of this, I thought that's exactly the direction that I feel like I want to take our department at OKC, is not so much a coach coming to the sports scientist and saying, what do we do today? And the sports scientist saying, we should do this, and everyone runs out there and does it. But teaching a coach or teaching someone who's in a slightly different area to you, it might be a strength and conditioning coach teaching a medical staff member, or a medical staff member teaching a strength and conditioning coach about something that they have a real particular expertise in, and sharing that expertise across the team so that there can almost be a better understanding of where each person is coming from in the decision-making process. Now, the things that I spend all day looking at, I'm not expecting a coach to understand those in the same depth that I understand them. But at least when I go talk to them, I hope they have a little bit of an understanding of where I'm coming from with it. And that takes a bit of work to get to that point in many instances, as opposed to, I feel like it's a really dumb model when a coach comes and says, what should I do? You say, do this, and they go do it. Sometimes we think of that as a win because we've got the coach on board that can do what we want them to do. But I think it's not a really integrated model where you're getting truly informed decisions that lead to the best outcomes. One example I'll give there is when we lay out training plans for our coaches, whether it's a weekly plan that we're going to try and stick to or a plan for that day that's more specific. I think the best days we have is when I give that plan to the coaches and they say, no, I don't like this. Like, this doesn't fit because of X, Y, and Z. But it's taken us almost a little while in the environment that I'm in right now to get to that point. So at the start, it was like, okay, we really trust what you guys are doing. Like, management's put this team in place. We want to get on board and do the best thing. So we're kind of just going to agree. And I almost had to sit there and say to the coaches, look, I want you guys to disagree with this. So I'm no basketball coach. Like, I can't come up with the best plan for all these guys in a basketball context. This is from a purely physical lens, and even then we're probably not getting it right all the time. So we need you guys to push back and say, no, this is not right. This is not going to fit for this particular point in time. It doesn't meet our basketball goals. And when we actually got to a little bit of that point, that's when we started to get better plans and better programs. And I don't necessarily know if we got better outcomes because that's really difficult to work out. But a little bit more engagement, a little bit more shared decision making, and I think that leads to better outcomes. But as I said, the outcomes bit is hard to measure. So the top point there is I think it's sometimes hard to gain perspective, and that's kind of an example of it. Is if I'm coming at a weekly plan from a physical perspective, I really want the guys to be ready physically. That's my area, trying to prep them up to play good basketball, and the plan I put together has that in mind. But what if that conflicts with the basketball goals? So let's say we've planned a lighter day out on the court today. That's the plan I take to the coaches, and our head coach is thinking, like, we really need to go live today and practice because what we did over the last 2 days was horrible, and the only way we can really practice it is if we're getting in some high intensity live work, like scrimmage type work in practice. Well, which goal is more important in that point? That we have the guys ready physically to the best of their physical state, or that they practice the basketball things that they need to do tomorrow night, which the coach is saying, if we don't do this practice, they're not going to be ready and they're not going to be in the best state to do that. So at that point in time, we might decide that we're going to do a really high intensity practice, and without the communication, that seems like a really terrible decision from a physical perspective, but they're basketball players, so maybe we can give a little bit on the physical side of things, and yeah, sure, maybe they're not quite as fresh, but was the benefit of the basketball work we got a better decision at that point in time? But I think you can only get to that point if everyone on the team kind of understands a little bit of the other perspectives, and that's where helping other people understand a little bit of the detail of your area. And as I said, no one's going to understand it as much as you if you're spending your head in that area all day doing those things. But a little bit of education across the board can really make the difference. And this is kind of what I strive for, or what we strive for with our team, what I talk to our staff about, is if we're going to make a decision, say we decide to practice really hard, even though we're playing tomorrow night and we're going to go for a little bit longer than what we planned. Let's not make an emotional decision without considering all the factors. Let's try and make it an informed decision. Okay, so we know we're playing tomorrow night, we've come off this is where the guys are at. We're going to do this because we feel like the basketball work and the benefit we get out of doing that basketball work outweighs the cost that we might have physically. So we know there's a cost associated, as opposed to the emotional, uninformed decision would be, I'm going to do this because I want to do this. The informed decision is, we're going to do this, we know there's a cost, but the benefits outweigh that. And so that's what I talk to our staff about all the time is, can we really make an informed decision? Now, I say making an informed decision all the time, it's just not achievable because you can't bring everyone together in a room every single day and say, okay, what are all the different scenarios? So this is kind of like the goal and what we're striving for, but it doesn't always happen. And then this is where I think the education piece really comes in, because there's going to be times where a coach in our environment is taking a player, taking him through an individual workout. Honestly, like sometimes 10 p.m., 11 p.m. at night, no one even knows that the player is in the building and things are going on. So at that point in time, can I sit down with the coach and say, okay, what are we going to do with this guy? How hard are we going to go? How much change of direction is he going to have? How continuous is the work going to be? And how long are we going to go for? Like, there's just no chance. But all of those concepts, which I think are important for the physical preparation, if we've spent time talking to the coach about those concepts, educating a little bit, okay, this is what happens when you change this drill, like the change of direction gets harder. That's one of the most stressful things we do out on the court, so have a think about the volume of that. If they have a little bit of education around that, they can make their own decisions in that moment, and they've had kind of our themes filtered through it. So this is where, you know, if we'd just been telling them what to do for the last 2 years, they wouldn't be as well equipped to make their own decision in that moment. Let's see if we got, here we go. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about subjective versus objective, or data-driven versus more subjective approaches. And this was a performance coach very experienced performance coach, said this to me at one point in time. I don't believe it unless I can see it with my own eyes. And they were referring to some data that we saw. And to me, as I said, we want to integrate coach experience and merge that with the more objective information that we're seeing, that we're gathering. To me, this was not an issue of, okay, he really doesn't believe the data or what's going on. To me, it was more, I don't really understand the data, and therefore I'm going to default to what I'm more comfortable with. And it was a pretty aggressive comment, to be honest. But I think that situation, we just needed to work through, okay, we need a little bit more education around this. How can we harness both? And you see this kind of polarizing views within the industry. I think, in my opinion, is, you know, someone over here is a data-driven practitioner, and someone over here uses their coach's eye because they've got a better coach's eye than anyone that's ever existed. And there's no middle ground for a lot of people. You know, people will just say, no, this is the better way, this is a better way. And I think that merging those two things and harnessing both of those things is where you land a better spot. But it's so polarizing, people get so emotional about it at times, that often doesn't happen. What have we got here? So this is an example of things that I think can be incorporated, and this is not by any means an exhaustive list, but I say decision maker because yes, we want to have shared decision making, but I think in many instances there's a single person that makes the final decision. And that can be small, like what exercise am I going to do today? Or how long are we going to go for today? Or is it the head coach saying, who am I going to pull off the bench and put in the game right now? So yes, we all talk about it, and there's a shared responsibility to that decision. But in the end, big or small, it's usually one person saying, okay, this is the way we're going to go. So you want to put all of these things around them, help equip them with all the information so that they can make the best decision possible. And so I think this objective component is only one small part of it. You know, what are different people's opinions? What are different people's values? What's the context and the particular situation? You know, time of season, age of the player. All these things really are pulling into every single decision that you make, whether it's a tiny decision or a big decision that's going to affect the whole team. This is, I think, like as a data-driven or evidence-driven approach, a spot that a lot of people land in at times is, okay, we've done all this research or we've read this paper and this is the best variable. And honestly, people love to hear that. People love to hear that, okay, we've had all of this information, we've had all this work happen, and we've come up with the best approach. This is it. Acute to chronic workload ratio is a classic example of it, and I'm not going to stand here and talk about it because if you want to listen to that, you know, pull up some Franco and Pellizzari work. But it's like, okay, we've pared everything down to one number, and if we go back to the previous slide, like all these things, we've just said, okay, there's one thing that comes out in this model that is more powerful than everything else, so we're going to reduce it down to one variable and make our decision, you know, primarily based off one thing. Now, I don't think there's no value in running these kinds of models. I think it teaches us about what's important, you know, what has more influence than other things, and so we learn from this work. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do this type of work. I'm just saying that we shouldn't be making decisions based off one thing that someone said was more important than everything else. And I think that can happen as well. You know, this is the type of situation that looks like we've got all this information, we've got a data point out here, and then we make our decision primarily based on that. It just doesn't really make any sense. But I think that's kind of the opposite of the subjective person who says, no, I don't listen to data and I'm never going to do that. And you know, you see some examples of head coaches, particularly in the States, like slamming data-driven approaches. This is the opposite of that in my mind. So both can be dangerous. Sorry, just going to grab a little sip of water here. This is a comment that was said to me by a high performance manager, someone who was very experienced in a very high profile position, and I disagreed with some directions that we were going. I bring this up because I think it's important how we communicate concepts to players, to staff, and how we communicate that in respect to other staff on our own staff or other staff on other teams or in other environments. And just the style of doing that has a real impact on our industry. And so it's just a concept that I wanted to throw up. More communication piece, but we're talking about communication and decision making, so I thought it was kind of relevant. And now a little bit of another concept which was really introduced to me by Dave Martin. I heard him speak about it recently. And he said that we need to create structures that not only support players and coaches, which I think is how we all think about it, but also breed confidence and support from other stakeholders. And so true in the environment that I'm in right now is that there's so many outside influences and people influencing usually one particular player, that we need to, we almost need to educate a broader group of people so that we can have everyone kind of jumping on board whichever direction we're going in. I think this is, excuse me, super important when we're talking about, front office, I call in the States, or your management groups here, CEOs, football managers, GMs. Those people need to have confidence in the systems that we're building. And I think I've definitely been guilty of this. Like at times we think, doesn't really matter what they think. We know we're doing the best thing for the player. That's what's really important. Or we know we're doing the best thing for the team and the coach. That's what's really important. But at the end of the day, those are the people kind of signing the checks and assembling teams and putting things together. So I think there's a real need to spend some time with those people, showing them what we're doing, building systems which kind of create a little bit of transparency for them so that they can see what's happening, so that they're going to get behind our programs and give us the support that we need to do our jobs. End of the day, we're still trying to produce the best outcome for the player, the team, but we can't do that if we don't have the support of those other people. And in the environment I'm in right now, there's so many outside groups influencing a player. So you might think about kind of I put family and friends here in entourage. Like literally some of our players just get around with this entourage. I don't even know what the people do, but there's just like 5 to 10 people deep just rolling behind this player walking down the street. And those people have such an influence at times over the players that if we don't have some type of connection with them or type of relationship with them, usually very informal, they can take the guy in a completely different direction. A funny example of that is one of our players, someone in his entourage that I think he kind of, he worked out with him in the summer. That means that the guy rebounds the ball for him when he's shooting in the summer, and I think he gets paid for that. Told him that when you eat the black bits on burnt toast, that's beneficial for your health and your performance. So now that player from now on wants his toast burnt, and he wants to eat all the black bits on the toast because that's going to help his performance. So I'm not sure where that came from, but these surrounding people have real influence in certain situations. That's a bit of an extreme example, but peripheral people, what we might think of as peripheral as management people or people at the league office, and those people are important because they do have an impact at different points in time. And I think we need to think about how do the models we're building help create confidence for them, a little bit of transparency. How do we educate them? A little bit, again, they don't need to be an expert in the area, but that's an important piece. And as I said, I can't take credit for that. That was all Dave Martin's concept, but I think it's a good one to think about. So that's about all I had. I just want to throw this model up again. I like this model about thinking about integrating all of these things. One aspect I didn't really talk very much about, which I think is super important, is the psychology of the player, the psychology of the team, and really thinking about those aspects. You know, even family and home life, which might have a big impact on a person at a given point in time. Understanding those things, and hopefully, you know, if you're lucky, there might be people on the team who have more of an idea about those things. If you've got welfare support officers or psychology services as part of your team, connecting with those people as much as possible is really important in the decision-making process. And again, decisions can be small. So if you're deciding, am I going to put another 10 kilos on the bar for today's squat, and you know that something's going on in their home life, which they're struggling a bit, and that might influence your decision. It might not, but you know, having that information at the ready, I think empowers your decision more, and empowers the decisions of other people throughout the organisation. So that's about all I had. So thank you.